It's my pleasure to introduce you to the other panelists on our panel tonight. First of all, Tracy Weeden, the center of the group. Dr. Weeden is still getting lots of feedback. Am I the only one hearing this?
No, I hear it.
Okay, thank you. Can we fix that? Dr. Weeden is a seasoned leader dedicated to advancing literacy success for all and academic excellence for children. She brings 28 years of experience to a calling of shaping dynamic systems change so that children are well prepared for the realities of the 21st century knowledge economy. May I call you Tracy? Is that okay?
Just
Thank
don't
you.
call me late for dinner.
Tracy's also a relentless literacy advocate who frames literacy as a fundamental human right that transforms the family tree when evidence-based practices are scaled responsibly. Her life's work has been to position literacy success for all as a moral imperative that creates a place at the table for every child and adult, regardless of zip code or country of origin. And I'm embarrassed to say I've been on Tracy's board for maybe 20 years, and it's the first time I've met her. So great to meet you. Thank you for being here. Next is the Honorable Secretary of Education here in Massachusetts. I will never call you honorable again unless you ask me to, but it is important. Patrick Tutwiler. Pat directs the Executive Office of Education, which oversees early education, K-12, and higher education. Secretary Tutwiler sits on each of the boards governing the Commonwealth's education agencies, as well as the University of Massachusetts system. He is Governor Maura Healey's top advisor on education and helped shape the Commonwealth's education agenda. Before being sworn in as secretary, Pat served as the senior program officer at the Boston-based Barr Foundation, a grant-making organization focused on arts, climate, and education. Prior to that, he was superintendent of the Lynn Public Schools and headmaster at Boston Public Schools. And then to my immediate right, Edward Fergus, professor of urban ecology and policy at Rutgers University. Now, I've already started talking to him about Boston University. My colleagues will tell you I'm a relentless recruiter. So prior to joining Rutgers in Newark, Eddie was associate professor of urban education and policy at Temple University and assistant professor of educational leadership and policy at NYU. Eddie is a former high school social studies teacher, program evaluator, and community school program director. His work is on the intersection of educational policy and outcomes with a specific focus on Black and Latino boys, academic and social engagement outcomes, disproportionality in special education and suspensions, and school climate conditions. He has published more than 24 articles, book chapters, evaluation reports, and 5 books. So welcome to all of you. So in 1968, the federal government invested an enormous amount of money in trying to answer the question that Emily raised about why it is we are not teaching children to read correctly. In 1990, I remember the Boston Globe hosting an event here at the Presidential Center in South Boston focused on this topic, and heard Gene Shaw, legendary professor of reading at Harvard University, talk about why we weren't doing it correctly. In 2004, I saw Ed Kamenui, who is the former commissioner of special education research at the U.S. Department of Education and an audience member here, talk about this in an audience of 1,000, at least 1,000 for the LA Times. Why are we here? Why are we here in 2023? Tracy?
You know, I believe we're here because we do not have a compelling collective vision for our country that's bigger than any individual ego or agenda. I think we are lacking a collective moonshot, and I'm so grateful for Emily's investigative reporting, because I see educators taking their power back. This cannot be legislated. Yes, we do need legislation, but we need to build awareness so that there's an understanding that this is a national crisis And if we're going to be a internationally competitive country, if we want to retain a democracy, this is all intersecting. If we don't want to leave our children who are EL learners behind, as our demographics are shifting, then we've got to get reading right. And I believe part of this is as well, the why. For those who are preparing educators for the future, Desmond Tutu has a famous quote, and it's, why don't we stop fishing people out of the river and look upstream to see why they fell in?
Mhm.
Are we really high integrity about preventing educator failure so that we can prevent student failure?
Thank you. Thank you. Pat, the state of Massachusetts for many years was heralded as being the strongest academic state in the United States. And yet you and I know that even pre-pandemic, there were children in the Commonwealth who were not learning to read early in the way that Emily described, and were lagging behind over the years. And yet we hid it behind high achieving outcomes at the high school level. What do we need to do about that? And I know your department is working on this, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, but what is the policy piece here?
So first, I need to admit, as I look out and see familiar faces here and enjoy the company of my colleagues on the stage, I'm experiencing supreme imposter syndrome right now. And I say that as a person who spent 14 years as a high school teacher and principal, and then went on to become a superintendent. But that aside, with that said, and folks' expectations lowered.
Our governor believes in you.
Well,
So do we.
now they're back up again. All right. What I would say is, I think we're on the right track in Massachusetts. That slide that was shown with the NAEP scores, the same year, 2019, when you look at Massachusetts, Massachusetts was #1. When you look at the performance of Black and Brown kids in the same year, they were scoring at or around 49th, 48th, relative to other states' performance. And so we have a real challenge here. And I think there's movement on that. And I'll share a little bit about that. About 4 years ago, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education developed a vision around literacy instruction in Massachusetts, which called for all readers, and I want to underscore all readers, reading by grade 1 en route to being proficient by grade 3, which is very, very courageous, in my opinion. No legislative requirement, no push from a governor or anyone else, because they knew that challenge existed. And they've developed a pretty robust strategy for addressing that, which addresses and acknowledges who's left behind when we think about literacy and who's moving forward in that space and who continues to struggle.
So, Eddie, your work specifically focuses on this topic that Emily raised about our assignment of challenges in schools to poverty, and both in disciplinary issues, but assignment to special education, to treatment through intervention. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit and kind of help the audience understand the impact of this when we, as we were chatting during the technical difficulty, like, why is it we look for workarounds rather than teaching what the children need?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to, similar to Pat, I'm in similar sort of imposter, but from a different vantage point of, I'm an English language learner. So for me, Spanish is my first language. I started learning English when I was about 9 years old when I came to the US. So whenever I'm doing anything, the fact that I'm in this field, that I talk in English all the time, and folks are like, I don't hear an accent. And I always say, well, I learned how to mimic an American accent. So, you know, so my imposter is in terms of always sounding like English is my first language, but it's not, you know? And I say that to contextualize the sort of the recognition, and I think Pat's kind of hinting at it. I think Emily was also sort of pointing at is the recognition of what are the set of conditions that are existing for a variety of populations that we're serving, right? Our multi-language learners, our students with disabilities, you know, our students who are existing in densities of poverty, and particularly densities that's occurred for a while, right? And in education, one of the things that's fascinating is the types of conditions that surround the endeavor of schools that really mire the degree to which good stuff happens in schools, right? The degree to which we have the right set of teachers showing up in our different types of schools. Meaning, and when I say the right set of teachers, the teachers who are, you know, in 2001, the SCA reauthorization, which we called at the time NCLB, gave us high quality teachers, right? We were so excited, like finally, we have to make sure that we actually have teachers who are teaching in the area in which they got their degree in, you know, how to novel idea, right? Well, guess what? We're still struggling with that. And in some areas where there's been persistent density, that condition continues to not only sort of exist, but the workarounds that happens with teachers who are good intentions, are dedicated to be there, are learning LLI, are being infused with balanced literacy, right? Because it's the thing that is the new hot thing. Unfortunately, education, we do a lot of hot things, and the hot things isn't always mired in good research, right? So that particular condition of, and I'm focusing on teachers because there's such an important variable for all the good stuff that can happen in schools, particularly in schools that have higher densities of poverty conditions, that when we have a sort of a gap there, right, it has a ripple effect. It has this domino sort of impact that it has, you know, the degree to which they know the science of reading to be able to do the reading well, right? One of the things that I, you know, as a quick story to contextualize how it happens, you know, I live in a school district in Westchester County in New York, and it's a school district that was under desegregation order for about 20 years. And we intentionally decided to move there because we want to be in a school system where our kids are not an anomaly, right? We want them to be surrounded by teachers that can be understand them. And in third grade, my oldest, who's turning 23 on Saturday, and my youngest is turning 19 tomorrow, which is why I can't be here tomorrow, right? Because I got to be there. The oldest, when he was in third grade, I got a call from the principal saying, you know, Mr. Fergus, I need you to come to school because we want you to sign off on your child being evaluated for special education. And I was like, huh. I said, okay. And I went, not my wife. And I told the principal, I said, you want me. You don't want my wife, right? So I like you know, and so I met with her, and what she talked about was, she said, well, we've been giving him all these interventions, but nothing's working. So we really want to, you know, start evaluating him. And I said, oh, well, that's great. Thank you for doing this stuff. I said, can you tell me what you did, how often you did it? Show me the data that they didn't make progress, right? And when they plateaued, what did you switch about the intervention in terms of the dosage, the frequency, right?
Right.
So,
Love it.
and
Love it.
have to. So the interventionist said, trust us, which I'm sure best intentions. So what I ended up doing, my wife and I did, was we actually hired, talk about sort of a rich man's game. We hired a literacy coach who happened to be a doctoral student that I was working with at NYU to work with my son for 2 years. And it reached the point by the time he was in 5th grade, he was actually at and above proficiency on the state assessments, right? He wasn't, you know, what transpired, what I knew had transpired was in kindergarten, he kept coming home with these pictures and these words. And I said, how are you learning? I knew enough to know that that's not enough. And then, but in 2nd grade, they started bringing in a phonics-based curriculum. So he was existing with confusion. And so this is a school district where I live. It's a Title I school district, right? And so I think about sort of the density to which of what happens, not just in the community, but the density to which how school systems that are living, in that type of sort of environment are swimming in sort of the just getting by, just doing the thing enough to just say that they're doing the thing, but it's not good in the long term for our kids who are in greatest need.
Okay. I want to bring this back to the topic of dyslexia for a minute. Those children who struggle even with effective instruction. This question is really aimed at Emily and at Tracy, so I'm happy to have both of you respond. But there has been some action in Congress at the federal level to focus on dyslexia as a unique condition that should be treated in a way as a medical condition with high levels of diagnoses and treatment. Very expensive approach to solving the problem of people with dyslexia. What's wrong with that approach?
Tracy, why don't you go first?
Well, I will tell you, what's wrong with it is, and I invite all educators who have access to a prison to go and visit. And spend time interviewing inmates. I had that opportunity in a maximum security prison in Livingston, Texas. And I spent the day with 60 inmates in 2 groups of 30. And I saw the NAEP statistics living and breathing in front of me. I saw men who were trying to earn a GED who couldn't read, who had been warehoused in special education classrooms, where teachers had not been apprenticed in the right work. Well-intentioned, poorly apprenticed. I saw the critical mass of these men coming from high poverty communities. Poverty is not density. It's not destiny. I saw mostly Black and brown men in that room. And I'll never forget the last one who stepped up to me and said, "Miss Jacob," from a Mexican, Puerto Rican blended family, life sentence. And he said, "Should I try to earn my GED? I have a life sentence." And I told him, "Jacob, learn to read. That's something no one can take from you." The First Step Act is ironically named, in my opinion. So that federal law is intended to screen for dyslexia among inmates and provide them with services. The first step is a model of prevention. As early as possible, identifying children who have reading disabilities and aligning all tiers of instruction. And I want to talk about imposter syndrome. I was a leader who didn't know what I didn't know. I was over curriculum instruction and assessment for the 7th largest district in the country. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And when I asked if we could provide dyslexia therapy, I was told we couldn't afford it. Think about that. Think about 48 to 50% of inmates in this country who are dyslexic. That's a moral dilemma, but it's really a moral imperative. And when we think about literacy as a form of privilege, if my children need dyslexia therapy, you better believe they're going to get it. But what if I have to choose between groceries, gas, and therapy? Think about all of the human potential that we're squandering. So we have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the inmates in the world. What's wrong with that math? So it goes back to having the will to do the right thing, regardless of zip code, for any child. Last point, at Neuhaus, we serve adults who have never learned to read. We have from 16 to an 88-year-old learning to read, and all of our instructors are certified academic language therapists. Our 88-year-old had the goal of reading to his grandchildren during Christmas time, and he achieved that goal. Why should he have to wait for 88 years to have that pleasure?
I'll add one thing, which, I think the definition of dyslexia is essentially if you struggle to read after you get good instruction, like it's still struggling to read. And so the fact that we're not giving good enough instruction to a lot of kids makes it very difficult to disentangle what's dyslexia and what's not being taught how to read. And so that's why we really, and MTSS, the whole idea of the way that we've set up the system presumes that there's good core instruction, and that's going to help us understand what's going on with the kids who aren't responding. But that system isn't working if there's not good core instruction in place. That said, as I said earlier, fixing core instruction isn't going to fix the problem for everyone. We have to acknowledge that some kids need more and will take more resources and take more money, but we will free up resources and money if we are not trying to get ourselves out of this problem through tier 2 intervention and through special education, which is what we're doing right now. You go into some school districts and there's a tremendous number of kids who are in tier 2. LLI, which I mentioned, is an intervention program, and there are many places that are using that as their core instruction. So we just have to get the core instruction right for all of the other systems to work right too. And there's problems in all the other systems, but until we fix the core instructional problem, it's like we're not going to be able to, we're just going to be spending money forever to get ourselves out of this problem. The amount of money that it's being spent publicly and privately on this problem is vast.
So thank you. I wanted someone or both of you to talk about prevention, which was the thing that I was hoping you would get to on this deeper therapeutic approach to treating dyslexia when we haven't put the prevention pieces in place. And I just want to acknowledge that the Neuhaus Center that Tracy leads took over the school district of Brownsville and many years ago and really implemented a program of prevention that the district locally got credit for, but nationally, no one really knew what was going on there. Dramatic shifts in implementation of prevention programs that resulted in many, many kids making tremendous progress where prior to that, it did not happen. So yeah,
David, I must acknowledge Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagan. This woman is
Right here.
phenomenal. She's one of my heroes and she's here. It was a grassroots effort and she's relentless and the work continues. It's actually in board policy that structured literacy is the way. So they've had maybe 10 different superintendents, but that's non-negotiable. So think about the power of that being an expectation. I don't know about you, but when I was apprenticed to be a principal and a superintendent, I wasn't taught, this is the most central part of scaling the right work. And leaders deserve to have this knowledge so that they can responsibly align all tiers of instruction.
So let me move us to the topic of teacher preparation, because this is my business and I won't put this on Eddie because he's in higher ed, but he does other things as well. So how do we change, really at scale, 1,500 colleges and schools of education across the country, many of whom are perhaps not doing everything that we know is necessary to differentiate instruction for the kinds of things that Emily, you described and we've been talking about here. And Pat, I'm going to come back to you. Like, what is the policy lever here? And you can talk just about the Commonwealth because that's
all I know. Yeah, I can't. Yeah.
So how do we encourage change?
Well, first, you need to get in touch with your values, right? And then you need to identify what power and authority you have. And explicitly, I would say the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts has some control. It's the licensing authority, has some control, if you want to be licensed in the state of Massachusetts, over what is taught in schools of education in the state. And they've already begun to make a move to ensure that there's evidence-based literacy strategies being taught to aspiring teachers, elementary teachers, teachers for students or who seek a license for moderate disabilities. That movement is already afoot. So I think you flex your muscles with the schools of education.
Other thoughts people have?
You know, so having been in two different sort of teacher ed programs, I think there is you know, Pat's correct in terms of the licensure side really helps to drive the manner in which schools of education, teacher prep programs can really sort of structure the types of courses. And then it becomes the faculty who are there, who know how to teach those courses. All right. And I will be the first to self-indict, you know, in terms of recognizing the depth of sort of faculty who are available in the programs who actually teach, you know, the science of reading versus teaching a class around instruction regarding reading, right? And I want to distinguish that, right? That there's a lot of instruction stuff, a lot of methodology courses. I teach this semester, I'm teaching this whole year I've been teaching social studies methods, right? Because I'm a former social studies teacher. And so I've been fascinated by, you know, I've been covering a little bit around sort of what do we know about reading in terms of social studies as a way to kind of think about integrated content. And I'm finding my student teachers who are emerging to be student teachers are like, well, wait a second, what do you mean the 5 pillars of reading? And I was like, okay, what did I assume was existing, right? And I think so the work has to be carefully crafted within teacher prep programs that really sort of identify these core areas, because as you asked before, in terms of the fill-in, school districts are filling in for what, you know, they're recognizing their staff as they're arriving and continue to be, right? So in some ways, school districts have become sort of mini teacher prep programs. And the concern is what they're filling in with is at times the hot stuff, right? That is of interest and is, you know, I heard about this thing, iReady. Everybody gets iReady. Like, let's do iReady. That'll fix it all, right? And I'm like, no, not really, right? But they're doing their best given the conditions that they're having to exist in.
I'd like to add to that if I may.
Please, Tracy.
You know, is teaching even a relevant profession anymore? My daughter is graduating from high school. I know I'm an old mama, but yeah, she is. And she did a 2-week internship at a charter school. And she said, Mom, I'm going to stop running from my calling. I know I'm called to do this. I know I'll be broke. I know it's going to be hard. You know, she starts thinking, but she said, I was in a classroom. It was an intervention classroom. And the children looked terrified, Mama. They couldn't read. And they knew they couldn't read. And I'm not okay with that. So what do I say as a mom? Do I encourage her? I told her to go for it. But you know, I had to just be honest with her about the current climate. Educators are not being honored in the most important of all professions. And we need to have a compelling argument and vision for that. They are the most important professionals, in my opinion. I love educators. And so I'd say that's a big piece. It goes back to that national vision. And just throwing dollars at the profession, that's not it. That's part of it.
That would help.
That would help. 100,000 a year, I say, starting salary. But, you know, we invest in this country in the things that we really believe in. So do we really believe in our children or don't we? Do we really believe in our educators or don't we? Are we going to set them up for success? The other thing I'd say is district leaders, you should be having conversations that are unsiloed with your universities and let them know you don't want to pay a second time for them to get the information they should have gotten the first time. Teachers paying for tuition, they don't get that time back. You're wasting their lives. Children, they don't get to do kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade again unless they're retained and then they drop out in middle school. That's not right. So it's demanding more. And I have met so many professors operating under the radar. They want to do the right work. They know the right work, but they're actually suffering for doing what's right. So that means deans and presidents of universities, they've got to step it up too and create the conditions for people to do the right thing.
I have one last question. Earlier in the week, I spoke with Kareem Weaver from Oakland's NAACP and asked him why it's so challenging to get change to happen. And his response, I really wanted him to come to talk about equity as an outcome. We're looking for equitable outcomes for children. And he said he believes the problem is that people don't see the consequence because it's so far away from them. The consequence of our actions early in school are too far away from us. But I want to come back to this topic of equity just briefly, because many of you talked about prison, but I don't think we have to focus just on prison. Like, what are the long-term problems with not learning to read early and having access to, which, by the way, I think Emily pointed this out. You'll also see it in a poster session tonight at the reception. Some of our faculty have put together a beautiful poster about the many facets of literacy. It's not just the learning to read print, but also everything else we as readers are able to do with text. But what are the problems of inequities in not learning to read early?
You know, so the core of my research work has been around disproportionality and special education suspension, you know, and so, and it's been an area of research work that I've been fortunate to do since early 2000s. And luckily there is federal legislation that requires state education departments to identify school districts that are disproportionately placing kids in special education. And it's become a conduit for understanding a variety for me in terms of my own research work, the conditions of schools. And so one of the dynamics that I continuously I've been stumbling into for the last 10 years is understanding that there's a manner in which schools have organized their tiered supports, tiered 1, tier 2, tier 3 types of supports that are woefully inadequate on multiple fronts. One, it's the, you know, we're layering a high dosage of interventions at tiers 2 and tier 3, right? As Emily was describing. And in a way that almost looks like that's the core program, right? And it's become inadequate. And what ends up transpiring is, so you have this sort of gaps in sort of what we do, how we do it, and who we're doing it for, alongside who it's being done to. And in particular, one of the areas of focus that I've been attentive to is the nature to which our existing societal understanding that who we understand has cognitive abilities and disabilities is also racialized and gendered, right? And so the dynamic that we're talking about sort of the nature to which we're understanding, you know, who's able to read and how we understand that their capacities of reading is also mired with and sits alongside our own societal sort of understandings or associational bias that we carry about why we understand somebody can't read or can't read, right? And it can't be lost on us, right? I work with school districts who have to address these issues. And, you know, a couple of months back, one of my districts they were doing their root cause analysis work with me. And, you know, there were principals who kept coming to the table with various poverty excuses. You know, my favorite one was, you know, principal said, well, I think the reason why the Black kids are identified with intellectual disabilities is because they're living in areas with a lot of power lines, right? And I was like, and I'm very curious when I hear things like that. And I'm like, can you tell me how that happens, right? Because I never want to assume. And another one said, well, the Black families are lacking health insurance, so therefore they're not catching this stuff early enough, right? So there's a litany of sort of these notions that are carried about these associational bias that are used to explain sort of cognitive abilities and disabilities. But the core issue is that there is a ripe condition of underwhelming environments and teacher preparation and intervention overload that's existing in our schools, that alongside with these associational biases are allowing for this particular type of impact, which is resulting in these habits of high rates of Black, Latinx, and Native American populations existing in special education that, interestingly enough, the same set of populations that are existing in our juvenile justice systems and in our prison systems, right? So we have to sort of understand the impact is just not in schools, but it becomes this interesting sort of domino effect across other agencies that our society also exists in. And so that's my concern around sort of, if we think about impact, that the impact is in schools, but the impact is also how we are extricating folks out of the potential of being good, continue to be the best citizens that they could be by sort of putting them on a particular path where they cannot be and achieve sort of areas that they can.
And Andy, what you said is so important. This has a generational impact. And I know for the city I'm from now is Houston. I grew up in Detroit, but I've been in Houston for 30 years. And Mayor Sylvester Turner has the only mayor's office of adult literacy in the country. And they convened providers so that we would stop working in silos. There is a literacy blueprint that the Barbara Bush Foundation is also a part of. Back to Brownsville, they were also the ones who launched the work with Elsa there. And the blueprint talks about health literacy, digital literacy. There are so many implications. Our adult literacy students say things like this when they learn to read. I don't order the special at the restaurant anymore because I can read the menu for myself. I have a certification now that I couldn't have earned, and my earnings have escalated to 25% more. I can read the prescription for my student, my child, and I, accidentally overdosed my kid because I couldn't read it. I ended up in the ER, and it just struck me some months ago, there was so much I had to read and sign, right? But what if I couldn't? So there's so many implications. I consider adult literacy the canary in the mine. So if you check out adult literacy for your community, if we don't change, then we're just exacerbating something that is deeply entrenched in terms of systemic classism and racism, because literacy is a form of currency. You can invest, and if you don't have it, there's a saying I've heard, if you don't have a place at the table, you might end up on the menu. That's the truth.
Patrick, anything, or Pat, anything to add?
They both have said it perfectly. The only thing that I would add, and this wouldn't necessarily drive, anyone to sort of change their mind, but it's what drives me. When we were standing over there and you asked me, this woman's wonderful, by the way, you can tell. She asked me, now we've only just met today. She came up to me and she said, how do you use your superpower? Like, that's not a question that I get asked every day or often or ever. But what I shared with her was that I use my superpower to create the conditions for dreams to be realized. And that has been since day one as a history teacher, right down there at Brighton High School, to my current role as Secretary of Education. That's what drives me to do what I do, make the decisions that I make. The implications, that was the question. They answered that beautifully. The only thing that I would add is that this work is about creating the conditions for people to realize their dreams. Thank you.
Emily, thank you for getting this conversation started. Tomorrow, we will have many deeper conversations with those who can join us. I want to tell you that it's not often that the Wheelock College gets the use of the fanciest building on campus. But following this panel, we will reconvene at the top floor of the Center for, the Computing and Data Science building, which is next door. The building looks like a Jenga set. And there will be a reception, a poster session that I will encourage you to take advantage of. Our faculty, doctoral students have some relevant posters and would love to engage you in conversation further. I want to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. I also want to thank our interpreters for being here tonight. And I want to give a special thank you to Mary Ellen Medayo and Kristen Kane for putting together this and tomorrow's event. You've given us lots to think about. Thank you all.
Thank you.